Okay? So it's just found in these three. And what we did is it actually breaks it down word for word. And by the way, this side's all in Greek. How's that fun? This side it's in English. And it breaks it down. What we would do is like we would look through word by word in Greek. Is this word, well, it's obviously in Matthew. Is this word in Luke? No. Or Mark, I'm sorry. Is this word in Luke? No. So what we do with that word? We highlighted it in purple. Next word. Is it in Matthew? Well, obviously. Is it in Mark? Yes. Is it in Luke? No. What do we do with it? We underline it in blue. Next word. Is this in Matthew? Well, obviously, yes. Is it in Mark? No. Is it in Luke? Yep. You see what I'm saying? We just go back and forth. Like all the purple highlight is only in Matthew. All the yellow highlight is only in Mark. All the green highlight, the blue highlight, is only in Luke. If it's got green highlight, it's in all three. If it's in Matthew and Mark, but not in Luke, it's underlined in blue. If it's in Mark and Luke, but not in Matthew, it's underlined in red. This is the fun stuff that this is what a seminary education is all about. But as you dig into it, now the good news is we did not do the rest of the book. We only had to do a couple of pages. But it does bring to mind some basic questions. And that is, well, if it's the words in red, we would assume those to be the words of Jesus. But then when we start comparing side by side, sometimes the words don't agree. And then you're left with a question, a nagging question. What did Jesus say? Or there might be other details that aren't the words of Jesus, but the narrator throws in different details than what we might find in one of the other Gospels. And we're kind of left with, early on it was a little disconcerting because I trusted those words in red a lot. I like those words in red. I want a page that's full of them, And then here we find out that, well, they don't always agree between the Gospels. Well, the good news in all of that, and it's very good news, but it took me a while to get to that point, is we believe that this New Testament witness, it shares very much how people's lives were transformed by the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And it was important stuff. People held on to it for years. They believed Jesus to come at any time, so they weren't writing things down early on. They were just sharing the incredible stories verbally by word of mouth. But as time went on, they began to realize it may be a while until Jesus comes. It may not be quite as quick as we anticipated. These are powerful stories. We want to share them. But they are shared in somewhat different ways. Now, once in a while, I am with a family in relation to a death in the family. In fact, this past week, I was in Brunswick for a little bit because our next intern, Tim Knies, his mom died. And so he called me on Sunday last week and to let me know about that. And, he's the youngest of 10 children. He's only 23 or 24 years old. And I can just tell he's pretty tenderhearted about everything. And so thankfully, Google provides maps and directions to find your way to places like Brunswick. And so I went over there for calling hours, and we got to know quite a few members of the family, and they were just showing pictures, and she was a ballerina when she was young, and just some neat stuff, and he's there at the casket just telling me all about this wonderfully sweet woman that was instrumental in his faith life growing up, and the siblings have their own kind of take on things. And I've noticed, I've done this many times with other families, siblings have different perspectives than other members of the family. They may not necessarily be contradictory, but they have different emphasis. They remember this about Aunt Susie, and someone else remembers that. And someone was touched by her hobbies, and someone else was touched by her humor. Someone else was touched by her the way that she faithfully worked through the years without getting any fanfare or any of the rest. So we're all touched in different ways. And when those folks tell their stories, it tells me a lot about Aunt Susie, but it really tells me more about the difference Aunt Susie made in so-and-so's life. Does that make sense? So you get to see the effect of Aunt Susie, as you will, on the person, and that becomes a testimony and a witness in and of itself. And so in our Gospels, we have the stories of how these people were affected through the ages, through the years, by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And it was a powerful witness for them, but it left different marks. And as these stories are written down, sometime later, we see those different emphases. So for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, there's a lot of emphasis on the teachings of Jesus. We've got that long Sermon on the Mount. I would not have 2 pages full of red ink if it were not for the Gospel of Matthew, because he's the one that records that long discourse by Jesus. Powerful things that we really appreciate. And in there, Jesus said, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law, but I have come to fulfill it. You will find in me the perfection of everything that was foretold long ago." That's important to Matthew. Matthew will 12 different times say, this happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. We go to Mark, and Mark doesn't have many teachings of Jesus at all. He's got a few parables. He's got quite a few healings. Mark has this kind of extended introduction into the crucifixion of Jesus. And for Mark, Jesus says, "I have come not to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many." So in Mark, we have this powerful testimony of a Christ who didn't come to lord it over people, but rather came in humble service, demonstrating what God was really about. In Luke, we find special concern for people who are outcasts, who are marginalized by society. So there's special care and concern for people who have leprosy, that the rest of the community doesn't want to be around. Special concern for widows and orphans. Special concern for women, who are oftentimes not given very much of a place in society at that time. And Luke also has a special concern for the poor. In fact, in Matthew, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." But in Luke, he has a portion of that same story, and Luke leaves out the spirit part. It says, "Blessed are the poor." So Luke just has concern for the downcast. And then for John, Jesus says, "I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly." And that life that is promised in John is not just some future one-day event, but rather for John, the abundant life that Jesus promises is something that we can claim a portion of right here, right now. Not in the sense of worldly riches or fame or any of that stuff necessarily, but in the sense of a perspective that understands the truth. That Christ has come, Christ has died, and Christ lives again, and in Him we have the very peace that we had in a lesson a week or so ago when Jesus says, "Peace be with you." We find that in the risen Christ. So we've got these perspectives that come to us, and it's again not so much about trying to figure out what Jesus actually said or didn't say, but it's about the effect that He had on people back then who changed their entire lives around and essentially changed the course of history because they believed what Jesus said and what Jesus did. And so the surprising truth behind these words in red is that they continue to have power for us today. We get a glimpse of Jesus. We get an even fuller glimpse of those who were transformed by Him. And that's the same thing we get in some respects from one another. When we gather in those funeral times or in those hospital rooms or even in those other times when together we huddle up and share the faith that we hold dear and our trust that our Lord will in fact see us through whatever it is we might have to face. So that's a little bit about an introduction to the Gospels. I might say just briefly as well, we didn't touch on the rest of the New Testament, but much of it was written by the Apostle Paul. And what's interesting about him is he doesn't even tell us very much about Jesus. He doesn't offer the teachings of Jesus, doesn't offer the parables, doesn't speak very much about the healing. But Paul does say that it's enough to know Jesus crucified and risen. And also it's interesting, of the few words that Paul includes of Jesus, he includes some that we share every weekend at Zion. When we gather around the table, each weekend I share with you the words of institution, those words that Jesus spoke over that last meal. They're found in Matthew, they're found in Mark, they're found in Luke, they're not found in John, but they are found in Paul, in the 1 Corinthians. And the particular words we use on Sunday and Saturday morning, Saturday nights, are the ones from 1 Corinthians. That's the closest rendition to the words of Jesus that we use. And so we share a little bit of how Paul was inspired, because he says, "For I decided to share with you what was first shared with us, that our Lord Jesus, on the night in which he was betrayed," etc., etc., etc. The gospel is passed on the faith, and we pass it on as well. That's the surprising truth behind the words of prayer. And the peace of God, which surpasses all human understanding, keep your hearts and minds rooted